Welcome everybody to the Lessons Learned Active Shooter webinar. Today we will be going through the events that took place in Colorado Springs back in 2007. The shooting took place at actually two different locations. We'll be going through that today. Thank you all for everybody that's jumping on the call today. The agenda for the webinar, we'll go through some fundamental definitions. Some of y'all have seen these definitions before, but I think it's important that everybody does understand them from the beginning. We'll talk about the profile of the shooter during this event, and ultimately the timelines of the events themselves. There, of course, was a hero here to talk about. And we'll go through some of the lessons learned. And there will be a question and answer session towards the end. So if you have questions at any time throughout the show that you would like answered, drop it into the Q&A box. You should see that as part of your webinar screen. And when we get to the end, I'll make sure that we'll address those if they are fitting for this webinar. But thanks everybody for joining. We'll go ahead and quickly get started. I've been providing active shooter response training and personal defense training for almost 14 years this coming summer. But on the active shooter side, we partner with educational facilities, houses of worship, and numerous other types of business entities to help them be better prepared for violent criminal attacks. And we do this through both e-learning programs as well as in-person live seminars where we'll go through, train up staff, train up team, and really just try to partner with these types of facilities to help them better understand and be better prepared. I do focus when we talk about the lessons learned, put the focus on really the entity itself and not so much on the law enforcement side of this. So this is specific more for individuals, for the administration, for the entity, for the staff, and we'll go through the lessons learned from that side of it. Of course, anytime that you are wanting to change policies or especially changing security equipment, if we were, talking about door locks and that kind of stuff, it's always best that you are speaking with different governing bodies such as the fire marshal to make sure that you're not violating any sort of code. As we go through this event, understand that like all active shooter events, they are all different from one another. And so the events that we'll go through are specific to the shootings that took place in Colorado Springs. There are different similarities that we'll see overlapped with other types of shootings, but understand we're specifically just talking about, ultimately this event. I mentioned two different locations. One of them took place at the New Life Church in Colorado Springs, Colorado. The other one took place about an hour north in Arvada, Colorado, at the Youth with a Mission training facility. The Youth with a Mission training facility, had about 80 students present, that night inside of that facility. And then about 12 hours later, the shooter ended up going to the church where he had a secondary location there. And so we'll be kind of going through the two different locations there, but they do sit about an hour apart from one another. And ultimately, why we can't change things to take away the past, it is important to look at these events and learn the lessons and figure out what we can do to be better prepared, for any sort of future event. The FBI has warned about not providing notoriety to any of the shooters. And so I'm not going to be doing that at all. I'll do my best not to mention his name. But it is important that we remember the faces of the victims, and the four victims that you see on the screen were those that were killed at the Youth with a Mission training facility. It was Tiffany Johnson and Philip Kraus. They both died as a result of shooting injuries, but there were also two other shooting victims that night as well that survived their injuries. At the New Life Church shooting, the two young girls seen are sisters, and those from the Works family, Rachel and Stephanie Works. They were killed in the parking lot of the New Life Church shooting. Their father was also shot. He survived his injuries. And then two other people had survivable injuries as well from the New Life shooting. And these are the people that we want to make sure that we are remembering. And so, as we talk about it, it's important to highlight the victims and highlight the heroes and do our best not to ever mention the name of the attacker, because that's what they want. They want us talking about it. And so we need to not meet their desires and hopefully over time, change some of those people that are seeking out notoriety through active shooter type situations. It's important that we define an active shooter event, and the FBI defines an active shooter as one or more individuals that are actively engaged in killing or attempting to kill people in a populated area. The active aspect of the definition means that there's opportunity to change things because it's ongoing. It's not something necessarily that has already happened, but the active side of it is it's completely ongoing, which means that our action steps have an opportunity to better the outcome and maybe prevent the fatalities or injuries altogether if we're able to act on different opportunities that may prevent themselves. Additionally speaking, any time that there's the active element to it, law enforcement's going to treat that very differently, with their response as well, because it puts a lot more urgency on stopping the attack. This bar graph shows the 484 total active shooter incidents that have taken place since 2000 up to 2022. So just recently, the report came out on 2022. There was a small drop of 50 total incidents that took place. Now, when we talk about an active shooter incident, that's very different than just your drug-induced or drug-involved drive-by shooting, right? Just local to us, just recently, there was a drive-by shooting where you had, I think, about 70, or more rounds that ultimately ended up getting fired during this drive-by shooting. And just like you would see in a normal textbook drive-by shooting, that's what happened. And somebody was killed as part of that. But that's very different than what you would normally see, or what we talk about when you talk about somebody going to something like a church facility or a house of worship with the intent on killing and harming people. Very different elements. And so there's been about 484 true FBI defined active shooter events since the year 2000, leading up to 2022. So when we do these breakdowns, these are the ones we're specifically talking about, not necessarily, all shootings that may fall under the umbrella, or different shootings that may fall under the umbrella of a mass shooting or a mass killer event. There's different definitions for a mass killing or a mass shooting. Most will fall back to the 3 or more victim definition that falls into that. But as I mentioned, that may be gang violence spillover, where you have 4 innocent people that were fallen victim to that gang violence, but they were victims of the gang violence potentially because somebody negligently shot them or accidentally shot them, not because somebody was intending to harm them. So when we're talking about active shooter events, we're talking about the suspect is intending to actually harm the victims there. With the time spent planning, it's important to understand that most active shooters do spend at least a month or two planning the attacks. This one was not any different. The shooter in this attack at least spent several weeks planning. He had emailed out different types of threats in the weeks prior to the attack. He had posted about in early October. So the shooting took place in December. He had posted back in early October, writing about his anger for the church. He had a video of the Youth with a Mission building on his computer that he had filmed. So he had filmed the layout of the building back in 2002, ultimately 5 years before the shooting ended up taking place there. So he had that video. Was it just pure coincidence that he had that video, or did he video it with intent to cause harm later? We don't know the answer to that. Ultimately, he died with those types of answers. But at some point, he did take that video and put it to some Marilyn Manson music, where as you're going through the hallway, that different music was playing from Marilyn Manson. But like I said, that was about 5 years before the incident. But he at least spent several weeks, if not more, preparing for these attacks, and likely much more than several months going into it. The shooter himself his entire family was homeschooled from a very early age. However, they were not, just kept out of society. Ultimately, he and his siblings were, part of different group field trips, other different group events and co-ops. He had plenty of other interaction, with kids that were his age. All the kids in the family were also offered the opportunity to go to regular public schools, and they had chosen not to do so. But he did share friends with his older brother, and he had plenty of interactions. Sometime during junior high or high school, he ended up in more of umbrella type programs where he was working with other kids around from day to day. He was also raised in a devout Christian home. He had a very strict Christianity upbringing. He had posted about how, he was really had a lot of anger about his upbringing with it. A lot of things that we would see as commonplace in an American household, with different books and different types of toys or movies or videos and that kind of stuff. He was raised where they were particularly, satanic or evil things. And so he definitely wrote a lot about that, later on. But his upbringing, was in a Christian home. His mother, was and still is, as far as I know, a Christian follower. But at the time, she had done a lot of volunteering and really working as a mentor and helping others as well. And so he was definitely brought up in a Christian home. He wanted to be a missionary, and he was involved in different sort of discipleship programs over the years growing up. He was involved with King's Kids. After he started to get more towards high school age, they thought that he would be a great choice for the Youth with a Mission program. And so he ultimately applied to YWAM that was located in Arvada, Colorado. That's the suburb right there outside of Denver. And he applied for their discipleship program. And ultimately, he was accepted into the program. And he had completed a 12-week discipleship training program with the Youth with a Mission program. And ultimately, in order to complete it, he had to go on a mission trip in Bosnia. And so after completing the textbook side of things with that 12-week program, he ended up getting kicked out of the program prior to going over to Bosnia. He was showing signs of immaturity. He had openly talked about hearing voices. He had claimed that he was bipolar to some of the staffers, and he was telling the staffers that he has issues with his medication. And ultimately, the staffers ended up being concerned with him going on the trip to Bosnia. And during this time, the final straw ended up being that the shooter was playing Marilyn Manson songs at the Christmas performance that year. And so they, did not feel comfortable with allowing him to continue in the program and ultimately kicked him out. And that was back in 2002, about 5 years, before. And so it would have put him roughly at about 19 years old, 18, 19 years old at the time that he was kicked out of that program. After being kicked out, he ultimately went on or started a journey, later on of researching and learning about other type of theologies. He is baptized at one point into the Church of Latter-day Saints. He had at least, gone to and studied and was around different satanic organizations and occult groups back in the 2003 time, and made some friends in different areas of these as well. In 2006, the New Life Church's founding pastor, Ted Haggard, was part of a scandal involving drug use, where he was accused of having desires and using, crystal meth and different methamphetamines and whatnot. He was also accused by a male prostitute of hiring the male prostitute over a 3-year period for sexual relations. And this, like I said, it's about a year before the shooting took place at the church. The mother, this was her favorite pastor. So the mother of the shooter, this was her favorite pastor. And this was definitely a big, change that likely happened, with the shooter. The shooter became very cynical of Christians around the same time. He had protested against Ted Haggard leading up to it, or during that time, as well as in his vehicle. In the aftermath of the shooting, there was a sign protesting the prior pastor as well. And so that I don't know if that was the change, obviously, but this definitely did lead to, his different outlook with the, Christian faith, at that point. He potentially was homosexual or bisexual himself, and started to see big influencers in his growing up as being hypocritical. And he was certainly vocal about a lot of that. The picture that you see on the screen was found after the shooting. You can see that he's got the pentagram stars written around different family members, his house, that kind of stuff. This pentagram was also found in his room in the aftermath. He may have been wearing this pentagram when he visited the New Life Church a couple of years prior to the shooting. Witnesses had remembered seeing, something similar to this. There was, a lot of concern, obviously when somebody came in wearing a pentagram into the church, he gathered a lot of attention. So it may not have been the exact one. However, this was found in his room in the aftermath. The shooter himself, this is his room. The picture was taken after the shooting took place, or the shootings took place. But in this, they were able to recover, different types of books, his computer. On his computer, he had about 500,000 images of pornography and child pornography. So he had been doing a lot of downloading, literally 500,000, roughly 500,000 images there. Additionally, he had a lot of information and downloads on different prior active shooter events. He was clearly fascinated specifically with the Columbine events, with the Virginia Tech shooting, and another individual who had attacked and killed a Christian leader. So he had a lot of that. The books that he had were on witchcraft, Satan, Messianic. He had a book on practical homicide. He had another book on how to survive a tactical shooting. And so again, especially the shooting books, the practical homicide, he definitely was doing his research and putting together his plan, prior to this attack. The mom at one point had described her son as a loner who had not had friends over to the house, since he had finished high school. And so his best friend would have been his father, and they had a lot of different discussions, over the years. He, did have other friends that he would talk to on the phone. He had different postings and was in different forums and chat groups online as well. The parents did not know that he had any firearms leading up to the event. At one point, the dad even had gone somewhat through the room to check and to look. I don't know if they, had concern that he was a danger to someone or himself, but the dad definitely did go and look through. At some point, there was ammunition that was shipped to the house. The parents had confronted him about the ammunition, and he just said that it was ammo that he was using to go hunting with a friend. So even at that point, they didn't have any reason to believe that it was anything ultimately that was other than that. So what was his motive? A lot of shooters ultimately take their motive to the grave, but this guy definitely looks like he, left painted a picture, left behind. He had a profound hatred for Christians. He wrote a letter to God that was his, suicide note that was found in the aftermath. And, it's a handwritten 2-page letter. But in that, he says to God, what have I done so wrong? What is wrong with me anyways? Am I really such a bad person? You stupid. And then something was redacted out of that. I didn't even ask to be born. Jesus, where are you? Do you even care these days? And so this letter goes on for about 2 pages. In there, you could tell that he was desperate and wanting help, but it was also very clear in the letter that he felt very betrayed, is that the people that he would reach out to for help, he felt that all of that only led to hurt and abuse. We had talked about previously that the pastor of the New Life Church, with the scandal, he definitely had issues with that, and talked about in this letter how he felt that a lot of the people that were supposed to be the positive influencers and the true Christians in his life were also the ones that were not the ones that were leading Christian lives. And he spoke about that in the letter. At one point, he also posted online that he had made a direct quote from one of the Columbine shooters about how he was armed and ready to kill, and was shooting to kill. He had ultimately had modified that quote, for his own personal threats and use, but it was a direct quote from that previous shooting. He made another quote that he was going to make a stand for the weak and the defenseless. He said, this is for all the young people that are still caught in the nightmare of Christianity, for all of those people who've been abused and mistreated and taken advantage of by this evil, sick religion, Christian America. This is your Columbine. And so that was one of the quotes that he had posted online. He had made 11 posts on the day of the New Life shooting. That would have been after the shooting that happened early that morning or the night before. He had posted in different groups under different usernames that, even the usernames themselves would have hints in his type of mentality. And so, his hate for Christianity, would, be the ultimate motive of this. There were potential other targets. And so we have 2 locations that he ended up shooting and killing people at. But additionally, he had maps of 2 other locations. One of the other locations was a coworker that he used to work with that ultimately, was in a job that he was laid off from. And he clearly wasn't happy about it. So he had a map of this coworker's house. There had been conflicts between him and different coworkers, and this was one of them. He also had a map for a Gnostic mass that was scheduled for the night before the shootings that took place. And so the shootings took place on December 9th. The night before, on December 8th, there was a Gnostic mass that he talked about attending. And so he had a map for that as well. And ultimately, this organization had asked the shooter previously to distance himself from the group. And so he had applied to be a member at some point of the group, ultimately was turned away. And he had a map, of the mass that was taking place on the night before. And so those were 2 definitely potential targets that he may have been thinking about doing instead, or, all of the locations that he had. When the shootings took place, the shooter showed up late on December the 8th, and he was going to the facility, the training facility, Youth with a Mission training facility. I've got the word spelled wrong up there, but Youth with a Mission, that ultimately he was going there. While en route there, he had several conversations with different people, including his cousin, his mother. He talked to his cousin for 38 minutes leading up to this. During this, he admitted to his cousin that he had consumed a beer and had taken a Xanax pill earlier that evening. I don't know if that was true or not, but that's what he had told his cousin. But he had also told his cousin and mother about attacking, or at least later on talked about attacking a female hostess or female waitress at an Applebee's restaurant that he went and ate at, and that was not true. But he clearly did attack other people that night. But he had a couple of different conversations, and ultimately about midnight knocked on the door of the Youth with a Mission training center. Now, there's about 80 students that were residing there at the time. However, I believe roughly half of them were away celebrating. And so this is the culmination of the event that he was kicked out of 5 years before. So this is ultimately the same night that he would have been kicked out, or roughly the same time that he would have been kicked out 5 years prior. And so half of the 80 people, are out celebrating. Roughly the other half are still there. And so he goes and knocks on the door. And when he knocks on the door, he was initially let in, and he basically told the person who opened the door, who thought it may have been one of the other students coming back from celebrating. They didn't know who it was, but they thought he had told the other students that he was a prior student there and just wanted to stay the night. And so they ended up letting him in, but were also very uncomfortable with him being there. And they were talking amongst themselves and that kind of stuff. At the same time, the shooter had a couple of different phone conversations with other people. But the initial girl that was talking to him, it just didn't sit right with her. And she went and told one of the staff members about it, and they all decided that the staff member would go ask him to leave, and that would have been Tiffany Johnson. And so Tiffany Johnson, as well as her boyfriend, were going to, ask this individual to leave. And they did, and the conversation was cordial, between what would happen. But ultimately, after the conversation, the shooter ended up pulling out a handgun and shooting at them. And shooting them. There were 4 people in the area at the time. All 4 people were injured, or all 4 people were shot, but 2 of them died, as a result of being shot that day. The other 2 did end up surviving that attack. But right as the shooting was ending, he somehow ended up outside. And why he ended up outside wasn't exactly clear, but as he ended up outside, the door was shut and it locked him out. And so he couldn't get back in, but was trying to get back in. So he's banging on the door, trying to get back in. For obvious reasons, they're not letting him back in. And you had some of those that were all celebrating coming back, and they see him knocking on the door, and he sees them. But he also, turns and runs away, ultimately as he sees him. Law enforcement was there within 1 minute. So they were there very quickly, but he was already gone ultimately from that area. And he, left the area. Nobody's really sure where his car was parked, but he did leave the area, and ultimately, he was gone. And so he had used the gun that's marked S13. It would be a Springfield XD handgun, 9mm, that he used in that shooting. So he was carrying that on his person at the time of that shooting. From there, he ended up going back home. And at some point, ultimately ended up going back home. As mentioned, he had posted about at least 11 posts on one Christian website, Christian forum group, prior to going to the church the next day, or later that day, really. After he had made the threats on the Christian forum group, they instantly had called the FBI and reported it. And so the FBI had called Arvada Police Department, pretty quickly early on, but they didn't have the website, and they didn't even have, the information of exactly what the threat was, just that something had been called in. And so they were alerting the police department about it. Well, at some point before the shooting, 12 hours later, the shooter had interactions with his mom. Everything seemed normal. The shooter had interactions with other people that had slept over at his mom's house that night as part of a slumber party. Again, she was involved in outreach and stuff. And again, really nothing ultimately stuck out from there. Well, the mom went to church about 9 a.m. the next morning, and he stayed behind. So they had seen him with, a suitcase that she had not seen him with prior, but didn't know really what it was. But ultimately, he went back to get on his computer, and that was very normal, for him. But the other guns that he ended up using were the AR-15 in the top left image, and that one is chambered in 6.8 SPC, so a different caliber than what is most common with the AR-15s. And the Beretta is the bottom image. So these are the guns that he took on his person to the church shooting. But additionally, he also had an AK-47 in the vehicle with him as well. He carried different smoke bombs and that kind of stuff that he ultimately, would end up using. But the shooting the night prior took place a little after midnight. And ultimately, the following shooting at the church took place, about 12 hours later. At some point, his photo was used in a lineup from the shooting that took place the night before. And I didn't really see where it was clear how they ended up with that. But his shooting, I mean, his photo was actually used in the lineup, and he was not picked out in that lineup from one of the witnesses from the night before. But then he shows up at the New Life Church later, ultimately that day. This church at the time had about 10,000 members, and roughly 7,000 people were present that day of the shooting. Well, the church had, just let out right prior to the shooting. So a lot of the 7,000 were leaving or had left, but definitely still hundreds, if not well more than that were still behind, talking, going to the bookstore, that kind of stuff as well, or, different parts of other different groups and whatnot. So still a lot of people that were on the campus itself. The Youth with a Mission facility, it's my understanding that they maintained an office on the New Life Church property. So that may have been a possible connection between the two. However, the church was at the very least well aware of the shooting that took place the night before. They had a church security team, they called it, or a safety response team. At least multiple members of the safety response team were armed. The volunteer team was about 15 to 20 people, but they had not had any prior training in tactics or firearms as a group anyway. There was at least one member that did have prior training. That was a prior law enforcement officer that had not long before recently moved to the Colorado Springs area and ultimately ended up becoming part of that response team or part of that security team. But 15 to 20 members on the team, they were talking about the shooting from the night before. They were very aware of it, and they had placed security team members at all of the doors just in case this guy ultimately ended up showing up. I personally spoke with one of the surviving security team members a few years back, and he talked about the events, talked about some of the different lessons that were learned from it. But he's learned lots of lessons, but he talked about how they didn't have any training, leading up to it. So it was a very loosely, defined team, but they were, a team, were working together. They were talking about it, and they did have the security guards or the security team members set up at each one of those doors. Additionally, you had 2 police officers there that were working extra duty details. So like many of the houses of worship or churches that are watching this webinar may have that today, right? You've got officers that are there. They have a presence, they're around, but they're also away doing things like working traffic details and helping out with the flow of cars coming in and out of the highways and whatnot. And so that wasn't any different today. And so you had the 2 officers that were present. Each one of them had a marked police car that was parked at the main entrance or the larger entrances to the facility. You can see the satellite image of it. They have the couple of different buildings there. The blue one at the top right, the small one, they call that the tent building. That's kind of a building that they use for the activities and whatnot. So they refer to that as the tent building. And I'll show you in the next image where everything took place, but it was around that building out in the parking lot where it ultimately ended up starting. But what he did was he took smoke bombs and set them at other entrances. And so he, placed them at the other entrances. And well, I mentioned the police officers, right? Well, the police officers ultimately ended up, going out and directing traffic. And then after they directed the traffic, they were headed home. And so they had just left the church facility, if I remember correctly, like a minute and a half, before the shooting actually started. So he very likely was watching them and waiting for them to leave. Now, we don't know this specifically, but I do know that most of the shooters are spending time planning. And when they spend time planning, it's easy to pick out when the opportunities would work best for the shooter to take the lives of other people. And so he very likely waited until the police officers were gone and they had left, prior to that. And so the police cars from the entrances were gone, but the security personnel was still around the different buildings and whatnot. So he sets off the smoke bombs at 2 entrances, which sends a lot of the security team members towards those entrances to ultimately go investigate. One of the security team members was on the 2nd floor with the pastor when everything started happening, but the others were, ultimately throughout the ground floor and at different entrances and whatnot. But the shooting started outside in the parking lot. Now, the area highlighted in red is the rough area, of the initial shooting. The shooter, he got out of his car and started the shooting in the parking lot, but then went into the entrance that's right there near where the end of the red highlighted box ultimately ends. The shooter's car is highlighted in the red at the top of the image that you're looking at. The yellow image is one of the victim vehicles. And so he gets out of his car and starts going through the parking lot. Witnesses had seen him at different points shooting from the hip, so not even aiming at all, just firing the weapon. But he ultimately, and really see, some of the witnesses, when they hear the gunfire, some witnesses described it as cars backfiring. Some actually saw him shooting and thought that it was a paintball gun and not a real firearm because he didn't look scared. He didn't look scared at all. He's just walking and shooting, and they did not see fear. And so since they did not see fear, they rationalized it, which is very normal, and and ultimately thought it was a paintball gun. And so they weren't responding like it was rifle fire. But he ends up in front of a 4Runner with multiple passengers in the vehicle. And when I say like right in front of the 4Runner, so they're looking at him, with the firearm. And ultimately, he ends up taking aim and shooting through the windshield and the side windows of the vehicle. He did not kill anyone inside that vehicle, but there were injuries inside of that vehicle. And it looks like they probably drove themselves, ultimately to the hospital. But from there, he ends up going over to the highlighted white minivan. And this is where the 2 victims that succumbed to their injuries were. The Works family was at the van. The 2 daughters were shot and killed. One died on the scene, one died later in the hospital, and their father that was with them was also shot and ultimately survived those injuries physically as well. But one of the witnesses, as he's going towards the entranceway, one of the witnesses had saw him working on the gun. So something came out of the gun. He's looking at it. He's not shooting. He's working on it. He was most likely reloading his rifle, ultimately at that time. Now, he had a lot of had several magazines with him for both the handguns and the rifles, but also had about 1,000 rounds, with him between on his person or inside the vehicle that day. So, I mean, he was definitely there to cause a lot of harm. But from there, he goes into the building. Now, when you go into the building, you have a long corridor that's over 100 yards long. When I talked to one of the survivors a few years ago, he said that it's about 120 yards from one side to the other. So just over the length of a football field, definitely a pretty large or long corridor. And so the survivor that I had spoken to was on the opposite end. He had just come from the pastor's office down the stairway and was armed. And when he hit that corridor, the shooter started shooting from the other side. So he said he had rifle rounds that were hitting things around him. He said it felt like burning sand was hitting him in the face. And so he's, trying to keep his body behind things that would prevent him from getting shot. But he's, ultimately the rounds are coming down the hallway, towards his direction. And, he obviously was concerned that he was going to be facing the attacker at some point. But you had another female security officer, security guard. And like I said, I use that term loosely, but the team, security team officer side of it. But she was prior law enforcement. So she had just lost her job from out of state in law enforcement and ended up moving to Colorado Springs. Well, after attending the church, after some time, she ends up joining the safety team. And so she was carrying a firearm this day, carrying a handgun. She obviously had her prior law enforcement training, leading up to it. Well, she comes out of a kind of a T in the hallway, and she sees him. Well, she backs up into that T in the hallway, and he's not looking at her. But at some point, she pulls her gun up, she takes aim, yells at him, warning him to drop the weapon. She yells something like, police, drop the weapon, or police stop, or something like that. And he turns and doesn't. And so she fires 5 rounds, makes contact, with at least multiple of those rounds. And at that point, she starts moving closer towards him. And she yells at him to stop again. And he starts shooting at her. And so he's shooting at her she obviously returned fire. She shot 5 more times. And then he kind of ended up falling behind or going behind something. And so she's fired a total of 10 times. If I remember correctly, 7 out of the 10 made contact either on him or hit something like a gun or something, hit something that he was carrying on his body. And after she engaged him, he pulled out the same handgun that he would have used the night before at the prior shooting, and he took his own life. So he committed suicide. And the shooting was over, and it only lasted about 3 minutes from the time it began until the time it would end. Now, I mentioned that you had police officers that had just left there, within about a minute and a half, after the shooting took place. Well, the police officers obviously got the 911 call pretty quickly and turned around very quickly, right? Instantly turned around and started coming back. But it was already, the shooting itself was already over, by the time that they had returned back to campus. They didn't even hear any of the gunshots that were taking place. But the Gene Usam was your security team member that ultimately ended up shooting and killing him. But he did take his own life. So why is that important? It's important to understand that he potentially could have continued to use that energy or that weapon to try to harm other people as well. But after somebody fought back, he gave up. And I've talked about this before in prior incidents, is that's something that we see ultimately a good bit. And so here's your hero. And this is just a clip. This is a clip from her interview that I'm going to play just to to understand what she did that day.
And all of a sudden, everyone's gone. There was no one left in the hallway except for me and the gunman.
And so, like I said, just a short clip, but while everybody else was running away, you had people that were running towards him and then were intentionally putting themselves into harm's way. And absolutely, were there heroes? Definitely so. And like I said, she had a law enforcement background, but it was, the courage that she had to move forward to stop the attacker. And there's no doubt that she saved plenty of lives that day. Like I said, he had 3 firearms on him, a 4th in the vehicle, over 1,000 rounds of ammunition as well. So, I mean, he was prepared to hurt a lot of people, and she was able to get it stopped the moment that he ended up coming inside of the building. And so, yeah, she's 100%, a hero. As we start to talk about some of the lessons that we're seeing in this, I think it's important to understand that this is not to talk about, what somebody did wrong, the survivors of it or the victims that didn't survive, right? This is not a talk about of what they did wrong, but this is, if we found ourselves in a similar event, what could be done differently that could have potentially changed the, ultimate outcome, if anything, for that matter. One of those pieces that it makes sense to make sure that you have as part of your safety team is eyes on, right? Is placing your team members in places that they could get information earlier on. So a safety team, a response team can only be, ultimately part of that plan. But the parking lot attendees on a Sunday morning, they should be receiving training on what to look for. They should have communication capabilities to be able to alert officers or other safety or security team members, right? Or if this was a school or a business, right, it's no different. Is that we want or we need to empower people to be able to to see things, to say something, right? And so that would be something here, is not just having security team members at the doors, but having eyes on out in the parking lot, to where hopefully if this takes place, we're able to get that information earlier on. And so, the parking lot attendees, the door greeters, ushers, all people that are there in a voluntary or, staff role that are getting this sort of training. Being prepared for distractions. He planted distractions. Like I said, this was a big facility, and by him planting smoke bombs at other entrances prior to the one that he was going in, that distracted the security team that day. That's where they were starting to put their focus, not on the other places, or not the other place where ultimately he ended up starting his attack. And so we've got to be very cautious with distractions. Now, one of the smoke bombs was put out by someone who just thought it was a child's prank, on the side of the building. So that did not, that I know of, get reported, at that time. One of the other ones did get reported, but we should be prepared for distractions, because somebody plans and spends a lot of time figuring out how to capitalize on vulnerabilities. You better believe that they're going to plan for things that could be distractions, or somebody could, copycat what took place. Acting on information. Now, they were acting on information, at different times. There's no doubt. They, knew about the shooting the night before at the church, and they were putting things in place to be better prepared that day. Like I said, they didn't have an expectation of violence, but they had the fear, of violence that day. And so they were acting on that information that they had learned. But even in the prior weeks leading up to it, there were, different emails and at one point potential letters that were talked about, at least to an outside organization. It's that kind of stuff that we want to make sure that it's not just the entity that's acting on the information. It's anybody that is coming across information, whether being posted on lines or in, communication, in voice communication with somebody, that they have a tendency to leak information about potential attacks. And I don't know that this one was any different, at least in weeks leading up to it. So if you see something that truly warrants, your fear, that you believe that somebody is trying to harm others, we want to make sure that we are, ultimately acting on that information. Take action quickly. And again, this comes back into training and whatnot. But if you think about, the shooter being in front of the vehicle within a couple of feet, where he's aiming a gun, at the occupants of the vehicle, the answer in that situation is run him over. And like I said, we can say this with hindsight, and I have no way of knowing what was going through the minds of the individuals in that car. I do know that it's normal for a human being to, a normal human being to rationalize the violence that they're seeing and try to figure out what else could be. But when you decide that that's the attacker, run the attacker over, use the vehicle as a weapon. And that potentially were other opportunities where people are in vehicles as well that knew that he was the attacker. And again, this is not to say what people did wrong. It's that if you find yourself in a similar situation, understand that you can use the vehicle as a weapon in that encounter if it's necessary, to protect the life of yourself or potentially, other people. Recognize any potential interruption point. And so at one point, like I said, that he was seen working on the rifle, eyes down, looking at it several seconds, trying to reload it. Whether or not there was somebody close enough to him, I don't know, right? But just understand that we have seen these types of situations come up in the past where opportunities do present themselves. And if it presents themselves, be prepared to capitalize on that moment. Because if the gun is not working and his focus is not up, we may have full opportunity to be able to interrupt something. Like I said, in this incident, it wasn't necessarily known whether or not somebody was close enough to be able to interrupt it or could have used the vehicle to run him down when he was reloading the gun, right? I don't know those details, but I do know that these types of situations do come up. And so we want to be prepared to take action ultimately in the future. The good girl with a gun that stopped the attacker this day. She, gave warnings. She shot. He, at some point, ended up shooting back at her again. She obviously has received a lot of training, and it's necessary, if we can, it's always best to, to use verbal de-escalation and warnings and that kind of stuff. But you also don't want to be in a situation where somebody has the gun and they're shooting at you when they have already proven to you that they're wanting to hurt you and potentially other people. So if you have the opportunity to stop the attacker before they're shooting at you, then you want to take that kind of action quickly, ultimately as well. Now, when we get in and we're talking about this kind of stuff, when you're looking at lethal and non-lethal, less lethal options, here it was the lethal option that clearly stopped the attacker before he was able to really harm people on the inside of that building where there were a lot of people present. And so, that was the lethal option that obviously worked best in this situation. But that's not always the answer, not always, the best answer. Obviously, if you're looking into the lethal option as part of your response, then you need to make sure that you're getting the appropriate training on, the firearms and have an understanding of when they should be used and ultimately when they should not be used. I would like to highlight, in the aftermath with law enforcement responding, law enforcement's coming in, obviously they're looking for a gunman and, and they found numerous security team or safety team members armed with firearms that at least two of those officers that had just left that facility not long before that, they had prior interaction with the safety team. So they may have recognized these faces, may have recognized these people. But when you're not wearing a uniform with a shiny badge, you also have to have concern with everybody else that's going to potentially be coming to a facility or going to even be already in the facility that is looking for the attacker with the gun that's not wearing the uniform and the shiny badge kind of thing, right? And so we got to be cautious with that kind of stuff. And so there's a lot of tactics that come into play with the use of firearms, in these types of situations or in crowded environments in general. And so if you're employing the lethal response, make sure that it's not just a false sense of security, but make sure that you're actually getting the proper training and putting in the work, to behind those kinds of tools. Or less lethal options, non-lethal options, such as taser energy weapons, right? We work a lot with taser conducted energy weapons on helping people have a less lethal option that you're probably more likely to use from day to day in a facility like a house of worship or a church than you are a firearm-based response. But if you need a gun to respond, the taser also may not be the best option in those situations, or even may not even be a viable option for that matter. But whatever tools that you're employing, you want to make sure that you have a proper understanding of those tools and how best to get the training, on them. Regardless, it is important that you are being prepared. And I've talked about this before. The Department of Homeland Security has talked about already that you should be physically and mentally prepared to deal with an active shooter situation. Now, I don't think you should be scared from day to day to deal with one, but you absolutely should be prepared and have the proper plans in place. And as I go around and talk to different churches and different facilities and different schools, most people don't have, a real good plan of action and have not received, the training best to respond to these types of situations. But this is 2023. There's lots of opportunities with training and knowledge, and it has been very clear that you should, be very prepared to deal with an active killer, type of threat, because the incidents are usually over, before law enforcement is able to respond, to the attacker. That's not always the case. And I've said this before, law enforcement's coming as fast as they can, and typically a lot of officers are coming. And in most of these situations, the officers are putting their own safety very quickly aside and are going into very dangerous situations courageously. There's no doubt about it. But in the large majority of situations, law enforcement's not present when the situation takes place or when it first starts. And so it's the people that are there that are always going to be the ultimate first responders. And so when you're trying to, put together the plan of action, it's important that you're putting together a good cohesive plan. Layered security. Like I said, if we're talking about a church, having volunteers out in the parking lot, you see communication on that, having the ability to communicate. Now, having the radio communication, having something that can work well during an emergency, something that you can spread that information around, but also for each of the individuals that have the training to just take the communication component and put it into play from day to day. If they recognize something, maybe they see a car out of place, they see someone that, that's getting ready to come in with a backpack, and, you've already decided as an entity to not allow people to come in with the backpacks, right? Interrupting that person before they come in is far better than after they've sat down at 10:30 in the morning in a church pew, 15 feet in front of in front of the pastor with a backpack, right? And so those communication components end up obviously being, very important, but, getting the individuals training, good, solid, training that covers all types of events on dealing with day-to-day conflicts, or in that worst case, that active shooter situation. I've been studying, hundreds of active shooter events for years, and there's, no doubt that there's different opportunities that have presented themselves many and many a times, and people wanted to do something, but they just did not know what to do. That is why training is important, is we can't, whether it's a safety team, security team, law enforcement, or everybody else, if an attack happens, it's the people that are caught in that moment that may be in the best position to be able to stop the attacker. And so making sure that the right people are getting the right training, and ultimately drilling and testing, and, and running through different drills from different drills that, could be simple tabletop discussions, right? Maybe sitting around drinking coffee on a Sunday morning, the safety team's talking about, well, if this happened, then what would be our response, and playing that out and starting to figure out where the holes are, in the training. But ultimately, testing, running through simulations and scenarios to put the plan, or to put the training through an evaluation and see, how well it worked. And you should be, doing that kind of stuff at least once a year, on the testing side of it. But also on the drilling, obviously, as often as possible, is that, most of the response and most of the preliminary opportunities to prevent something fall, back on the people that are closest to it, and, not on the outside entities or agencies. The events that took place that day, like I said, absolutely horrific. 4 people lost their lives. Many, many, many more obviously were injured psychologically as well. Having all of this take place at a youth discipleship training facility and a church with 10,000 members, there's no doubt that this, was hard, on those communities, hard on that church, going from a, pastor that had to ultimately be fired, that was the founder of that church back in 1984, to having an active shooter come there and harm people over his hate for Christianity, and having him show up, at the discipleship training and killing people there. There's no doubt that was extremely difficult, for them. But it is important that we look at these events and figure out how to be better prepared, for next time. If y'all have questions, you're welcome to drop your questions and answers. Drop your questions in the Q&A section of the webinar. I'll make sure that I do my best to respond to those. I thank everybody for tuning in. As I've mentioned previously, I'm available to discuss the plans, discuss your safety teams, to discuss the events of this webinar further, and to discuss training. We, have an online active shooter response program that I would love to take the time to see if it's a good fit for your facility. But one of the biggest issues I've run into over the years of teaching is that it's hard to get everybody in the same room at the same time with all the volunteers and staff. Is that there's always going to be people that can't be there for a live in-person event. And the online program makes that very easy. People get to go through on their own time at their own pace when it's going to be, obviously most convenient for them. And so, the online program makes it very easy to give people the knowledge to be better prepared to help prevent these attacks, or to be better prepared in the response of these attacks. So I'd love to talk to you further to discuss that program, or anything else that we have to help with. Obviously, there's, you set that time, we'll set that call. There's no obligations on any of it. I just want to be able to help people. I want to be able to help you. I want to be able to help your entity to be better prepared for these types of situations. On next month's webinar, we will be going through all of the 2022 active shooter situation. I say all of the. We're going to be going through the FBI's report on the 50 active shooter incidents that took place that last year. What can we learn from them? And so we're going to dive deeper into that report. The date for that is already on the calendar. The webinar is already up on the website, but it's going to be on June the 13th at 10 a.m. Central Time, or 11 a.m. Eastern time in that. You can already register for it ultimately on the website. One of the questions that I just received, can we get access to the recording? Yes, absolutely. And so last month I decided that I was going to go ahead and put this information out publicly, after the webinar is completed. So each one of these webinars is now available on the Defender School YouTube page. So you can watch them as much as you want, or it makes it easy for you to obviously share them with others. If you're going over to the YouTube page, do me a favor and go ahead and subscribe to that channel, because as we put these webinars on, I want to make it easier to be able to get that information out, ultimately to other people. But yes, we will continue moving forward and publishing these webinars after we complete them. But thank y'all for taking the time to tune in today. If you need any help with better understanding active shooter events or training, don't hesitate to reach out, and we will have that discussion from there. Thank you.